Ranga, hi. Good to have you with us. How have you been?
I've been good, Ashu. How are you doing?
Doing very well, Ranga. And this is an interesting conversation. Looking forward to this conversation. I mean, given with what you're doing with data, and there is a huge emphasis and focus that you have towards data, right? And I think it's now become cliched almost, right? I think this is jargon which is part of I think every conversation, right? That data is the new oil, right? To an extent that I think each one of us started to kind of repel it, right? We've had enough of it, but I think that's the new normal, right? I think data is something which is very very important, and I think especially in a post-COVID world, right, where we don't necessarily have very clear indicators, right? I mean, past is going to become very futile, right, in many ways, because the influence in consumer is changing in a very different way. That essentially means that the stress in organizations is going to be very different. And like I said, right, we're essentially in very uncharted territories, right? Thus, it becomes important to have right kind of structures, have right kind of products implemented within your ecosystem, right, to get that sensibility, right, to being able to predict the future. I think that's essentially going to be very very important. Thus, this conversation becomes very important. My team hates me for this, right, because I think every conversation that I get into, is an interesting conversation from my side. But looking forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. Same here. Yeah. In fact, I would like to also say that, whatever has happened in the past is probably not a good predictor of the future, especially because of the pandemic.
Absolutely. It's completely changed, right? And we're going to touch on some of those aspects, right, through the course of the conversation. But before we do that, Raga, I'd love you to take me through, all the great work that you've done, right? A quick round of introduction would be helpful, and we dive into the session from there.
Absolutely. Yeah. So my name is Ranga. I'm the founder, CEO of the Data Team. At the Data Team, we're actually building a product called as Cadence.ai. It's a B2B SaaS product meant for large enterprises that want to monetize their customer data. So we've been in the business for the last 6 years. Cadence has formally launched as a product like 2.5 years ago. And we've been growing almost at a 2x growth on an annual basis since then.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting. Again, it's an important question in the construct of it, right? I mean, what made you do this? I'm sure, and typically what happens is, why do I ask this question, right? Is because when you're building a business, right? That motivation is very very important, and that motivation essentially, if it comes from an experiential source, right? It just helps you go a little longer, right? So I'd love to know a little more about your motivation and what possibly inspired you to start looking at this area, right, and the construct of the company today. Tell me a little more about that.
Sure. Yeah. I was actually based in the US for a long time. After my grad school days, I was a geek out and out, right, ever since my bachelor's days itself. And one of the first things that happened at that time was an assignment for a client here in the Asia Pacific region. Actually, it was a Singapore plus India based bank. And it was in the context of working with that bank, I realized that there's so much of, a gap between the best practices that the Silicon Valley types have been very used to versus, what we here in Asia have access to. And that set the ball rolling with respect to saying, let's actually bring that kind of expertise with what do we do with large scale data? How do we do data science? How do we do machine learning? And bring it to the world of Asia. So that was one of the starting points. And then the dovetailing into this kind of a business model really came into play when we started to receive all of these, spam calls from, bank agents here in India that said, sir, do you want a loan? Sir, do you want a loan? Even though they probably already very clearly know that I don't want a loan, right? So it became very, very, personal for me at some level that, we need to do something about addressing this. And even to this day, I don't think the problem is fully addressed at all, right? So there's a huge scope for the kind of work that we do with Cadence. And I feel that the mission is just getting started here.
Interesting. Ranga, you touched upon a very important aspect, right? That's monetizing data. And I think it's I think a lot of people are talking about it, right? But I would want to really understand it in your context, right? I mean, monetizing data is to an extent also being loosely kind of used, right, across companies and monetizing data, right? But I think it's easier said than done, right? What's the construct of that, right? So for example, I mean, take me through your product suite, right? Take me through the process of, for example, engaging with enterprises. This is usually a very very difficult aspect, right? Also, the fact that organizations are structured in different ways, right? The hierarchies are different, the operational structures are different, right? The authorization is different. Within organizations, departments dealing with each other becomes a hugely complex problem, right? And then there is data which is sitting across all of these silos, right? Which is not necessarily interact with them, barring a few Excels, right? There is a huge inefficiency which is there, right? Tell me a little more about that, right? Where does this entire thing fit in?
Sure. Yeah. I think there are probably 3-4 things to talk about here.
Sure.
The first is the fact that in most cases, the enterprises have approached this problem of data monetization in a way that it puts the cart before the horse.
Right.
Meaning that they've gone about building large-scale data platforms.
Right.
I think some people call it the data lake, some people call it the cloud, but they've actually kind of built it out as the end to itself, right?
Right.
So it's just sitting there,
right.
Gathering data and dust over a period of time.
Right.
And then what ends up happening is 90% of those projects are absolutely useless from a business value perspective.
Right.
So that's point number one. That's actually the first pain point that we see. The second pain point we see is that even when the data is lots, right? Especially that's the case with large enterprises here in the Asia side of the world, because the population is so big. We see that because of the pandemic, the use cases are also becoming very interesting and innovative, right? The business keeps demanding newer and newer things.
Right.
So on the one hand, data's lots, use cases are many, but what connects the two together is actually, a bunch of what we call as analytics that need to happen, right? The process of extracting insights. That part of the process is still very fundamentally human driven.
Right.
Especially in a labor intensive market like India, we see that it's always a case of let me throw more people at the problem, or let me outsource it to my favorite analytics vendor, right? And then that kind of a approach, I think it worked great in the early days when people are still trying to get their feet wet with respect to what can analytics do for me, right? But then nowadays, the speed at which the data is being generated and the speed at which business wants new use cases done, this human-centric approach just doesn't cut it anymore.
Right.
In fact, we've seen the problem where, case in point, one of our big banking clients, they had a pretty good team of data engineers, data scientists, and tech talent in general, right? But then the first year when the unicorns started getting minted here in India, huge amount of money just went and captured that entire talent.
Right.
So much so that within a span of 3 months, close to 8 people left in that team of data workers in that particular banking division, and they just lost that entire institutional knowledge that had been built up in that in the brains of these team members. So we see that this human-led approach to doing analytics is kind of broken for multiple reasons. This being one of them. The other being, of course, the time it takes to get to that value.
Right.
So Cadence is actually engineered to automate the standard set of customer analytics that need to happen so that this monetization use cases can be done much faster.
Very interesting. Ranga, do you want to take me through a case study? And I think for many people who want to listen to this and watch this session, right, it'll be very interesting for them to sort of put all of this together, right? Because like I said, I mean, there are just too many aspects around it, right? I mean, there is data which is primary data, and then there is secondary data, right? And each organization is kind of collating that. It's all coming together. And like you said, right? I mean, while a lot of people are talking about data lakes that are getting set up, but essentially it's nothing but digital. What we had, right? The stacks of file, right? This is essentially those stacks of file in a digital format, right? There's a huge missing gap when it comes to interactivity, right? So if you could possibly highlight a case study, that would be very interesting for, without, of course, and I understand that, there are limitations, right? But if you could give us a case study without taking the name of, say, a client or a situation, if you could help us understand that, that'll be very helpful.
Definitely. Let me take that bank itself as an example.
Sure.
So one of the first things that I did once the first set of lockdowns started to ease out is to go and try withdraw cash at the ATM. What I realized is that I actually forgot the PIN for my debit card. And I think it's kind of occurred to us, a few of us, at least in my friend circle. So what ends up happening then is you try to enter the PIN based on what you recollect, and if you just go through a couple of attempts and if you get it wrong, the card gets locked immediately, right? So what ends up happening afterwards is where the rubber hits the road when it comes to digital transformation. So how digital your bank is comes down to how quickly you can react to these kinds of situations. So in this case, like the first reaction that I had at least, is to go take a look at my mobile banking application, because I'd rather go into a branch, right? I don't know about you. I'd rather even call up the call center, right? It's all completely mobile driven from a banking experience perspective. So I was looking at my banking application to see if there was a method for me to unlock my debit card because it was locked due to incorrect PIN. But no, there's no way to do that. So then I was forced to call up to the call center, and I was using my registered phone number, right? So the bank knew me. The KYC details were already filled in. So if the bank had really chosen to, they could have easily picked up the fact that I was calling in from a registered number and immediately given me exactly the information that I was looking for, right? But they didn't. I was actually made to go through the entire rigmarole of menu options, choose 1 for English, 2 for Hindi, 3 for Tamil, etc. And then after the 5-minute long sequence, and I finally got to an agent, the agent, was, basically going through the process of asking questions of what was my pain point. So if you just put yourself through my shoes, like 10 minutes of panic, and I'm just waiting in that ATM line trying to withdraw cash.
I can imagine.
So now if you flip it around and say, what can the bank do? Actually, the bank already has information that I'm trying to use my debit card. The bank's, it's the bank's ATM. So it knows the fact that the wrong PIN has been entered. It knows that the card has been locked because it's the bank's internal system that's doing it. And then I'm calling in through my registered number. So all of these 4 pieces of information are with the bank. So if you just put all of those together, the first thing that needs to happen is the moment I call in, people, the bank should already know that people who have their cards locked, they end up calling in or they end up looking at the mobile banking application to want to unlock the card immediately. So they can just put 2 and 2 together and close the loop immediately. It takes all of like 5 seconds to do that. So that's one of the use cases that we were able to do.
That's very interesting, right? And I think what you're kind of referring to is and alluding to is a lot of inefficiencies, right? Systemic inefficiencies that exist, right? Because of, say, certain archaic processes that have been, that weren't necessarily designed for these times, right? They're possibly 15, 17-year-old processes, and and we kind of continue to live with them. That's a very interesting point that you highlight, right? Raga, I have a very interesting question on mindset, right? And I think mindset is a huge challenge that you deal with when you're dealing with enterprise clients, right? And I'm going to come to that, right? Especially in the Indian context. But before I do that, I would want to actually, talk a little about COVID, right? COVID is an unreal situation, right? I think in each one of our lives, right? And I think it's been an extremely complex situation for many businesses, right? At multiple levels, right? One is, of course, how do you continue to sort of manage their existing, consumer base, right? In terms of, because the experience now has to be shifted, recreated digitally, right? And that essentially means that there is possibly a lot of data that they've had, which they never necessarily looked at with that seriousness, and now it's become important for them to comprehend. I think that's one side of it, right? The other side of it is that the new customer that they need to acquire, which is, I think, a constant for each organization which is out there, a going concern which is out there, is that the consumer behavior is completely changed, right? The exposure is completely changed, the influence is completely changed. The possibility to transact is much faster because of UPI, credit availability, and so many other things, right? And the product life cycles are going to completely shift, right? Which essentially means that they're not going to see those products. We're not going to experience 5-7 year product life cycles. We're going to see much shorter life cycles. That essentially means that they'll have to have a lot of consumer side data. They'll have to merge these two, right? To essentially ensure that they acquire right, they communicate right, and second, they serve the customer right. So consumer experience, for example, is going to become very, very large, and I think that will possibly lead into a lot of retention, right? Eventually, and a lesser cost of acquisition, because eventually everybody's going to be pouring in to acquire the same customer in a digital market, right? Now, this is an extremely complex condition. I mean, it's so much more easier when we kind of want to sort of when we want to put it across, right? When you want to debate on it, talk about it, discuss it, right? But it's an extremely complicated situation, right? In a large ship environment, right? What do you make out of this, right? I mean, where are the gaps? What are the challenges that are there for the organization, right? And how critical is it going to become to have? I mean, take a step back and then just think of the architecture of the organization, right? And bring it together in a way where there's operational efficiency which gets revealed. And I'm essentially picking this up from the earlier point that you highlighted, right? What do you think is going to be the way forward in an environment as circumstance?
Yeah. I think one part of it is related to education. We need to make the client aware that the concept of digital is actually not disconnected from data or analytics or the rest of whatever needs to happen from an operation standpoint. It's all it has to be a tightly integrated stack. So and the way we do that is by making them realize that data doesn't get produced in isolation. It's actually being produced by one of your applications, right? It's not humans trying to enter data in an Excel sheet. It's actually being things that are getting collected because your customers are interacting with you on a regular basis. So if you just take a look at logically what needs to happen there. If data getting produced by applications gets processed and so on, then whatever insights that you're producing has to come back to the application to close the loop. And it so happens that there are multiple applications because of digital, disrupting the world. But ultimately, all of those are just channels. Right? They just happen to be different ways in which we consume as end users our services, our content, and things like that. So if you just look at them as delivery channels, the underlying application is just one and the same, right? And that's the kind of like mindset change that the banks or telecom companies or oil and gas companies, aviation companies, all of these have to go through. And we work across all of these sectors, and these are sectors which are quite traditional in their outlook, right? We don't actually end up working with their digital natives at all, right? Like any of these internet era born companies, right? Because though they understand it much better, we work with the traditional industries, and those industries, they're waking up to these possibilities, obviously. But the good part is that the integration of the stack is something that they realize has to happen now. Now is the best place, the best time to actually invest and get this done.
Right. Raga, I can kind of relate with what you're saying. I understand. I think the challenge for you is possibly, if not 10x, at least an easy 5-7x, right? Because given that a lot of these traditional businesses, the kind of offline engagements that they've had, right? It's just an absolutely insane task, right, for all of that to sort of come together, which actually sort of leads me to my next sort of a question, right? That mindset is a huge challenge, right? When you actually wanted to sort of talk all of these things, you kind of alluded to it, right? Saying that education is something which is important. People need to pick up on, people need to be educated, right? Because this adoption is going to only increase once they understand the relevance of it, right? But there are not a lot of people who understand the seriousness of their existence, right? Is going to be extremely difficult, right? Given the environment that we are in, given the way consumer is essentially behaving. I mean, I have had the opportunity of talking to many, for example, CFOs and CMOs, right, of traditional organizations, right? The way it works for them is that, there's a manufacturing setup, then there is a distribution setup, there is a wholesalers network, and then there are last leg of distributors and then retailers, right? And for them to collect data, right, in terms of consumer behavior is just so much more archaic, right? It's extremely difficult, right? But these are people who are not. I mean, when you talk to them, right, it's very easy for them to rubbish saying that newer world brands are going to take forever to sort of get to that point. What they're not understanding is that the consumer is already shifted, right? The consumer is already consuming a lot of content. So clearly, there's an engagement which is getting established, right? And it will not be too long a time before that shift happens, and it's going to be a substantial, significant shift, right? Which could put their existence under question, right? And that's something which is a huge problem, right? What's your sense of it? How difficult is mindset as a problem to deal with, right, in an ecosystem that you operate in?
Yeah, in fact, that's a very good point. And we get asked this question all the time because some of these enterprises have not been used to thinking along these lines. And I think the way we challenge them is to say, look, you don't need to go anywhere different in terms of trying to find out where you can tap into. The data resides with you, right? I mean, let's say, for instance, you're a bank that's been around for 60 plus years, ever since, just right after the independence, right? The bank has been established, it's been going on. And even some of the newer age private banks have been around for 30 years now. They've been collecting data. So it's not as though the data doesn't exist. The data has been there. In fact, we think that almost 80% of whatever is required for generating value is already existing within the bank or within the telecom company, within the setup. It's only the remaining like 15-20% of it which is coming from purely digital sources. So that's point number one, right? It's to just recognize that data is already there. The second point, which is also equally important, is the expertise is already there. Like there are industry experts, process experts who've been in the client organization for so many years. So it's not as though they don't know what to do. They know exactly what needs to happen. Now the question is, can you make it happen faster, right? Can you capture revenue faster? And one thing I wanted to mention here is it's actually not just about operational efficiency and retention. I think those are very important topics, but also about being able to capitalize on opportunities to sell more or try to do cross-sell better, like try to have relevance in the point of marketing, right? So all of those are also very important. These are top-line driven use cases as well. So I would say the expertise and data already being there kind of gives them the comfort that they don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? That kind of a thing. They can actually leverage whatever they already have. What they need to do is the mindset change, and that's why the critical transformation needs to happen. So for that to happen, I think the the first steps that we lead them down in the journey of is this agile mindset, right? Don't think of it as like a capex project that needs to happen in 2 years' time, where it's all or nothing, that kind of an outcome. Instead, just approach it in phases. Just launch something, do a trial. There will always be users who will complain about you. That's okay, but there will be these few users who will really like you for what you do. And those are your early champions. Make their lives super efficient. Make it really worthwhile for them to engage with you, and then that becomes the virtuous cycle that you can build on top of.
Interesting. Well, I love the word cross-sell, right? I mean, I've been a banker and I know what you kind of referring to, right? I think that's a constant. I think that's a constant effort, right? Irrespective of where you are, right? I think everybody in the bank is selling, right? I think that's how I think banks today are kind of designed. But Ranga, this is a very interesting point, right? I mean, and when we used to sort of, for example, in banking, I think even for example today, right? I think a lot of cross-sells, for example, that happens, right, essentially happens basis availability of funds in your account, right, and not necessarily. Of course, there's a huge talk and conversation around, how do they want to understand a customer, how do they want to understand trends and stuff like that, but they tend to typically miss out on very smaller aspects, right? And like I said, everything is essentially designed around the availability of funds, right? Today the consumer is in a very different environment, right? The consumer is, like I said, I mean, they understand the priorities very clearly. They understand what they require. They understand they're a little more educated than possibly what was the case 5-7 years back. You need a slightly more holistic understanding. That's number one. Number two, even risk profiles, for example, have changed, right? Right. I mean, because we've exposed to too many things. I mean, if you look at the newer world solutions, right? I mean, if you look at, say, for example, new world insurance tech companies or insure tech companies, you're looking at new world fintech companies, they are actually factoring a lot of behavioral aspects, right? Now, when you talk of, say, cross-sell, right? And if you talk about monetization of data, now, when you look at banking stack, for example, right? And I'm taking banking stack because, we've kind of continued to talk about it, right? Is largely, like I said, very two-dimensional data, right? It is data which doesn't necessarily gives you a background, right? And other possibilities. What's your sense of it? And I mean, this could be possibly a solution in future, right? But I'm saying, do you feel that there is a requirement to understand for many of these institutions in a better way than where they stand today? And there could be a huge resistance, right, in terms of accepting that there is a possibility like this which could exist and is required for the time, right? How important do you think is it become now to fuse a lot of other consumption data, experiential data with existing two-dimensional data that exists, and transactional data that exists with bank systems to understand a customer better? What is your sense of that? What do you make out of that?
Ashu, let me actually give you an example of this. When I started my working professional life here in India, again, after coming back from the US, I had a salary account with the banker who had a tie-up with my employer at that time.
Right.
Now, ever since I went private, obviously we started off with our own banker at that time.
Right.
And then since then we transitioned over to another banker.
Right.
So as it is, I have 3 different bank accounts as an individual. I'm sure that's the case with you, right?
Right.
And I've not closed any of these accounts for whatever reason. Right. So if you look at my first salary account, where I used to have tens of lakhs of rupees lying around, now it's just having 10,000 rupees,
right,
as an example.
Right.
Now, if that bank were to conclude that my risk profile is based out of 10,000 rupees, or my ability to spend is actually based out of 10,000 rupees, that's clearly an incomplete picture about me as an individual.
Right.
But if you really look at what happens in most banks behind the scenes, that's exactly what happens, to your point. And that's a very old way of looking at things, right? Most cases, we all in the digital world have multiple different bankers. Each of them be used for very different purposes. Like somebody's given us a consumer durable loan for buying a washing machine. We're going to use them only for that, right? We have mandates for salary accounts. Fantastic. We could just going to use them only for that. This bank has done a very good job of promoting their wealth management portfolio for whatever reason. I'm going to use them only for that. That doesn't mean that that's my sum total of existence, right? That's actually going to be a fragmented existence that I lead across all these digital lives.
Completely agree.
Right? So how do I, as an individual bank, figure out that there is this portion of Ashu's life that I don't know about, which I'm able to kind of infer based on what people like Ashu have typically done, like 20 years of experience, fantastic repertoire of past work. It cannot be that he's just parking 10,000 rupees with me, right? He's clearly having 90% of his portfolio sitting outside.
Right.
So how do I gauge that? And that's exactly where AI plays a critical role, and that's the kind of models that we've actually already built out.
Interesting.
So you say this as futuristic technology, but the technology is already here.
No, sure. I mean, I understand, right? I mean, I understand. And there are quite a few players who are doing that, right? In fact, I mean, if you look at neobanks as a concept, right, they're essentially using a lot of this information that exists on the consumer side, right? And they're making it available for, I think, now banking partners who are essentially going to be the service side of the game, right? And I think that's the construct. And I think beautifully put, right? Thank you so much for doing that. I mean, I was, I've been on the product side in a banking industry, right? I've been on, essentially the equity side and commodity side in banking institutions, right? And this is something which was a huge problem, right? Because, the fundamental thesis of doing any suggestive, advisory business, right, was essentially dependent on transactional data. Now, transactional data was never enough, right? And like you completely and correctly said, right, that we only have fragmented information which is available, right? I think that just makes so much more sense, right? And I think banks need to become smarter, right? I think it's going to be a question of survival. Otherwise, they're just going to continue to hold. For example, they're just going to be an operational partner, right? I think somebody else is going to be doing the smart work, right? In that sense, Ranga, I'm gonna move into a slightly a related question, but also an important question, but a slightly different question. This is a category which is very underserved, right? It's been talked about, I think, by all tech players, right, large and small, which are essentially SMEs and MSMEs. And I think globally, I think every business leader, all global economies, kind of accept this fact that SMEs, MSMEs will continue to be the backbone of any country, right? I think because the kind of employment that they generate, the kind of it's very difficult for large enterprises to continue to do everything, right? And thus it becomes important that a lot of these organizations will continue to support them in the journey, right? Now, what happens in the process is that these are essentially a large part of this business, a large proportion of these businesses continue to be family-run businesses, right? They're not necessarily businesses which are choosing to sort of move in the direction of, say, looking at data, bringing in AI to help them in better decision making, right? And there are just so much more inefficiencies. So if you talk about inefficiencies in large organizations, these are organizations that are at least 10x of those inefficiencies, right? Mindset becomes a huge challenge, right? What's your sense of it? I mean, if you look at India as a market, and not just India, but if you look at Asia as a market, right? SMEs, MSMEs have a very critical role to play, right? What's your sense of it? I mean, what do you think, and how do you think data can, one, make a difference to their lives? That's one. Second, how important is it to get into that mode of interaction, right? So that they start understanding the need and the requirement to bring in scientific methods, bringing in technology to help them deliver better. What's your sense of this, right? What are some of those challenges and solutions, right, that need to be done to get this entire segment to come in and start consuming technology?
I think there are many solutions that are possible approaching this particular problem statement of SMEs being able to leverage technology like this effectively. Right. I think we are trying to do our bit by recognizing that in many cases, the first point of contact that the SMEs have is actually with an enterprise partner, right? Like a banker who's a lender to them, or a payment company who's actually providing them the wherewithal to actually collect payments at the front end, etc. So we feel that the disadvantage that the SMEs have, especially when it comes to a technology like Cadence, is that they don't have that kind of volume of data that the enterprise has. Right. But at the same time, it's the critical role that the SMEs play in fulfilling the last mile, right? In many cases, like if you take a look at payments or retail, almost the entirety of the business is actually controlled by the SME market as a whole, right? So we do believe that there is a very good partner angle that can come into play, and that's something that we are driving actively. So we think of these use cases as B2B2C, where we're enabling our client, who are actually enterprise clients like payment companies, bankers, retailers, to in turn allow their merchant companies, right, who are members of their network in certain shape or form, whatever is the service or the product that they consume, and then allow them in turn to cater to their hyper-local audiences, right? Allow them to in turn cater to their loyal network of members, of customers, or fan base, right? And we believe that's the way that things like footfalls will increase. That's the way that customer lifetime value will increase at that local level by leveraging the tooling and the data that is actually being collected by the partners in the ecosystem.
Right.
that's something that we are actively engaged in today.
Very interesting. Ranga, from discussing the macro challenges, I'm gonna talk about the internal challenges, right? And I think every technology company today is going through massive challenges, right? And I think one critical standout factor is human resource, right? Talent. And I think it's just become difficult and very expensive, right? To bring in right talent, to retain right talent, right? I think we've been reading of articles, right, where there have been BMW bikes that are being given, right, and work from home from wherever, right? That's been given, right?
Yeah.
What's your sense of it, right? I mean, you're a company which is essentially working on data. You're working on artificial intelligence. You're making an organization intelligence, right? The pressure on you is much higher, right? The expectation from you is much higher. That essentially means you need a very strong second leg, third leg, fourth leg, right? I mean, across the entire stack of people that you have, right? It just becomes very, very important to have a very efficient set of people, right? How is that? How are you looking to tackle that challenge, right? Given what we are seeing, the massive liquidity that we're seeing in the market, right, where talent is being sucked by just about a few, and it's now, to an extent, people are justifying it as a moat, right? And people are actually raising a large round of capital to essentially ensure that they can continue to hold a good set of people with themselves for the longest time, right? What's your sense of it? How difficult is this become from an operations standpoint?
Yeah, very topical question, something that I spent a lot more time than I'd originally planned for in the recent months.
Right.
I think we have not found the magic answer, but we have found some things that work for us. One thing is to recognize the fact that world over, there is this trend of people finally feeling unshackled by their workplace.
Right.
So due to the pandemic. So earlier, I think people used to have this rigidity about stability of the workplace, having a very familiar work setting in which they go in and go out on a daily basis, right? All of that got disrupted, as a result of which it also triggered these thought processes in people's minds that I don't have to be okay with that kind of an worldview anymore, right? It's perfectly all right for me to take the risk and go with a startup. So that's a good cultural change that's happening in India, especially for fantastic talent that's coming in from tier 2, tier 3 cities, right? They no longer have to migrate to a tier 1 city. They don't have to worry about just getting like a job in an MNC or a big company like Infosys or a Cognizant. Like they can actually now think about startups as a viable career option. That's one good trend. The other good trend is, of course, the unicorns being minted is both a good and a bad. It's good because people recognize that there's actually money to be made for everybody, not just for the unicorns themselves. The bad is, of course, the BMW bikes that you alluded to. That's very hard to compete against, I can tell you that. But also the thing that we emphasize always is it's more important that you have the right mentors if you're a person who's keen to grow your career. It's not just enough that you have money or that you have perks at your disposal. And that's where I think startups continue to play a very critical role. So even in our case, we have a very good training program set up internally for grooming the next batch of data experts, right? And that training program is backed by mentors, backed by seniors in the organization that work very hands-on with every single one of our members. So that's something that we obviously use as an attraction for people wanting to join us, and that's worked very well for us. At the end of the day, we're not also looking at hiring 4,000 of like 50,000 people. Even yesterday, I was reading Infosys hired 35,000 freshers. We don't need that kind of volume. We just need about 10 people on an average at any point in time to join us in the company. So, and that's something that we can afford with this kind of policies that we have put in place. But yeah, I think it is a very, very challenging market, especially now. And even if you use a small set of keywords associated with AI in your resume, I can assure you that there'll be a 2x inflation in your salary for good or for bad, right? That's sadly the state of affairs right now.
But are BMWs on the card?
No, I don't think we'll ever do that, even if we raise funding. I think that's just stretching the line.
You could have been a little more diplomatic about it, right? But no, I think I completely understand, and I completely understand where you're coming from and the challenges that are there, right? I think a lot of this needs to normalize. I think we are in a hyperinflation environment, right, when it comes to all of this, right? Because I think this is not sustainable, right? I think but I think we're gonna reserve that conversation for our next. We're gonna reserve that topic for our next conversation, right? And I think that's an important one. I think the sensitivity needs to come in, right? we cannot, organizations cannot continue to fund employee salaries and more importantly expectations, right? Basis, funding driven play, right? Or that liquidity condition. I think it's just abnormal, right?
Yep.
I think it's going to lead into crash and burns. And I have a theory around that, but like I said, we'll possibly reserve it for next time, right? But, an absolutely interesting conversation, Ranga. Towards the end of the conversation, what are the next 2 years like, right? I mean, I would have loved to ask you a 5-year question, but I think we're just in unreal times, right?
Yeah.
But I'll limit myself to a 5-year question. But what are the next 5 years? Not next 2 years like for the company?
Yeah. So we're looking at, like I said, actively expanding in the geographic sense. Like APAC is one critical area of expansion. Likewise in North America. We're also looking at, bringing on board venture capital in certain form or strategic investments in certain form to make sure that we are able to do justice to the growth that we are planning.
Right.
But the most important thing is we do believe that the problem statement of what we have set out to tackle is actually even more front and center given the digital pandemic. So now it's only a case of how fast we can execute on it. So
Right.
we've got some very ambitious targets of growing the product revenue more than 3 times on a yearly basis for the next 2-3 years, and get to a stage where we get recognized as the enterprise brand when it comes to customer monetization. So hopefully we'll have actually got to execute that in 2 years' time.
Very interesting. And new product execution. I mean, are there subsets within the existing product that you have? Are there subsets that are in the plans, that are in the process? Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. So we, in fact, just 3-4 months ago, launched a version of our product which is geared towards identifying non-performing assets. So you mentioned about large corporates and things like that. So if a bank is lending to them, can I know in advance, like 6 months in advance, that this asset is actually going to become non-performing? Again, it's a very topical problem given the times, especially in the developing regions like India, Philippines, where we operate. We do believe that that's going to take off in a big way. There are also forays that we are doing in the aviation side, because that's a sector that's waiting to bounce back up with full energy once the pandemic regulations go off. And we do believe there is a big opportunity right there. So those are areas that we're actually trying to bring more monetization opportunities into.
Very interesting. I would love to discuss some of those aspects, across specific sessions, right? Because I think these industries in itself are very, very interesting, right? I mean, I've been having conversations with many founders where we've been discussing risk, for example, right? And that is customer risk, right? And risk around lending, for example, right? And we've been talking about new innovative models, right? Where there is a lot of blended information now which is coming in, right? Underwriting, for example, taking a completely different turn, right? We were in fact discussing a completely different model of lending, right? Which is essentially far more defined than an open ecosystem, right? That exists. So there are many innovations that are happening, right? And I would possibly look to have those discussions with you across some focus sessions. Ranga, it will be a pleasure to have you with us.
Happy to.
I mean, I do this towards the end of my conversations. This is typically my last question, right? I mean, I think entrepreneurship is a very lonely journey, right? Everybody has a learning, and everybody has an advice to give, right? And more often than not, founders don't want to give an advice, but I think it's important, right? Advice is suggestion, right? Your observations are very, very important. If you can pass it on to a lot of other founders that are out there in the ecosystem, it just becomes helpful, right? It becomes an added comfort, right? In that scheme of things, right? What would that be, right? You've been at it, what are some of the key things that you think are very important, right? That a founder should look at, right? Advice, suggestion, the way you want to put it.
Sure. Yeah. I would say the lonely journey that it is can only be understated, right? It can get intensely lonely.
Right.
So one of the things that I realized midway through the first 3-4 years of starting up is I need an advisor. I mean, I need not just one, multiple advisors.
Sure.
And that's one of the first things I realized I was missing. So the moment I got a few of them, the kind of vistas that opened up were many, including just the ability to be able to share with somebody in a way that was, completely non-judgmental on what is actually happening inside my brain, so to speak. But then the good fortune was that one of those advisors actually came on board full time as a co-founder. So that's been a big blessing for me. And I would encourage anybody who's starting up on their own. While I think it's a fantastic journey to go through, it's definitely a very learning experience. At some point, there is merit in bringing on board at least advisors, if not co-founders, and I think it's never too late to bring on board co-founders, right?
Right.
I mean, there's this popular myth that either you start off together on the journey, or you're just going to remain lonely for the longest of times. I don't think that is true. I think it's perfectly feasible to bring on board very good advisorial talent, and that's something that I would encourage anybody who's starting up to absolutely do pretty early on.
Interesting. Thank you so much for taking the time out. It was a lovely session, right? How I wish, that this can go on, right? But like I said, I would love to have some focused discussions with you. I think there is a lot of work that needs to sort of happen. I think there are a lot of white spaces that exist within industries, right? I think this transition is something which is just throwing up many case studies, right? Many possibilities. And I think it just, and given that, you're at a vantage point, right, where you have, you're working with a lot of these large enterprises, right? And you can understand and see those gaps that exist, right? It just becomes so much more interesting, right? And I look forward to doing it soon, right? In a more sector focused way, right? But thank you so much for taking the time out. It was a lovely conversation, right? Thank you for taking us through your journey, some of the key aspects, challenges that exist, right? And bringing on board the right talent without necessarily the hype of incentivizing them with tools and toys, right? That could largely be cosmetic, right? And could have a much smaller survival value, right? I think you need to give them a path, right? You need to have them as part of your stakeholder play, right? And I think that's a beautiful piece that I want to take away from this conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. It was a pleasure to have you.
The pleasure is mine, Ashu. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you.